Episode 58, award-winning actor, director, author, and communications guru, Alan Alda. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Alan Alda. Alan is an actor, director, author, and communications guru. He has received 6 Emmys and been nominated 34 times. He has also been nominated 3 times for a Tony and once for an Oscar. He is most known for playing Dr. Hawkeye Pierce on the TV series MASH and has been inducted into the Television Hall of Fame. He is also an accomplished author with a number of New York Times best-selling books, the latest one titled, If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face? My Adventures in the Art and Science of Relating and Communicating. He is the co-founder of the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. And he is also the host of his own podcast called Clear and Vivid. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, to start with, we're doing this interview during the midst of this pandemic. You know, you're a doctor, of course, right? What's your view on it?
You know what's funny is having played a doctor for so long on television, I actually had a friend whose husband fell down in the bathroom and knocked himself unconscious. And her first thought was, I have to call Alan.
Because surely there was a MASH episode that covered that.
Well, I said to her later, I said, what did you think I would do? Come over and tell him a couple of good jokes? What help can I be? I don't know anything about that.
Yeah. I know you're a humble person, but to play a role so well and for so long, where there are people out there that honestly probably mistake you for a doctor, that sort of says something.
For me, it's easy to be gullible because if a performance is pretty good, I get drawn in by it, and I tend to believe it as much as the actor does. And the guy who played the psychiatrist, Sidney Friedman, on the show was a wonderful actor, Alan Arbus. And we used to sit and talk between scenes. And I was very interested in psychiatric theory. And I'd bring up names to him, like Kohut and other theorists. And I'd say, well, what do you think of that? And he'd say, Alan, I'm not a psychiatrist.
I want to start, Alan, if we could, just rewinding the clock way back. To suggest that you had a highly unusual childhood would probably be an understatement. You would travel town to town with your family as your father performed in these burlesque shows. So I've got a range of audience listeners here. Not everyone knows what a burlesque show is. So what were these shows?
No, I noticed that people under 40 never heard of such a thing.
What were these shows like, and what was it like being a witness to it?
Well, I was only two and a half, 3 when I started standing in the wings watching my father play in burlesque, and we would travel from town to town. And the show would start out with the chorus girls singing an opening number, usually at the end of which they'd tear open their shirts and bare their breasts. They were singing, I forget some Civil War song. At the end of the number, a flag was spotlit and a fan was blowing it, and they pulled open their shirts. It was patriotic and inspiring.
Right.
And my father was the singer on the side of the stage who nobody was looking at because of the chorus girls. And there was actually an official title for that job that he had, which was he was the tit singer. And it was just what they called that job. He was also a straight man for comedians who were very well known in burlesque. And he was thought to be an especially good straight man. Straight man is very important to the comic. In fact, there are straight men who would hire comics to be their partners, because the straight man was sometimes the most important part of it, because the straight man sets up the joke, makes the comedian have the arena to play in. And the more precisely and the better he sets up that premise, the funnier the comic can be. So usually they're thought of as not very important, but it's like the front part of a joke. If you don't tell the front part of the joke right, the punchline doesn't work. And you certainly can't just say the punchline. You got to build up to it.
So if you were that young, does it leave any sort of imprint on you? Like, do you have strong memories of that period?
Yeah, in our house, the budget for G-strings is unusually high. One of the nice things about it was the strippers were a little standoffish. I don't know, there was something about that job, maybe, that you wouldn't go into that job if you were a warm, sharing person. Something that puts you in control of the audience if you're seductively dancing naked in front of them, I think. I should have asked Sidney Friedman about that.
Right.
But the chorus girls were very motherly, and they would take me up to the dressing room, and I was a little boy, and they'd comb my hair, and they'd be very caring of me, and I think I benefited from that. I really appreciated that.
And meanwhile, you've been pretty open about talking about your mother, who was diagnosed, or maybe she wasn't diagnosed, but certainly in hindsight, she was bipolar.
No, I don't think she was bipolar.
Oh, she wasn't?
She was diagnosed as being schizophrenic and paranoid.
Okay.
And had some scary episodes. But I benefited from the chorus girls mothering me, even though my mother did love me very much and was very affectionate. But she was also paranoid and thought I was trying to kill her. So that kind of took some of the sheen off her love. A good deal of the time in my childhood, I was upset that I felt I didn't have a real mother. And it was only when I got to be an adult and could see things in perspective that I realized she was ill. She couldn't help it. And I had much more compassion for her later. It's too bad, if you're not trained in compassion and empathy, sometimes it doesn't come naturally. And you grow up with anger instead of thoughtfulness.
Well, as you grew up and you obviously came to understand what was happening, did it help you at all, or was it even a struggle as you were an adult?
I was, as a young adult, very self-protective, and I had a little bit of a shell around me to protect myself from I don't know what. I must have had some pretty bad experiences growing up, but I wasn't as open as I learned to be later, and I'm glad I could.
I think it was past the time period when you were traveling with your father, or somewhere a little bit later, 6 or 7 years old, you contracted polio. And this was, I don't want to compare and contrast to what we're living through right now, but it was certainly pretty scary. You could get paralyzed from it. You could certainly die from it. And I know one of your books I read, you described the treatment, which sounded almost as bad as the condition. Could you describe that experience?
Yeah, I was 7 years old. My father had just been hired by Warner Brothers on a 7-year term contract, which was kind of a slave labor contract because they paid you very little and they owned you. But the first picture they put him in was an amazing assignment. He was playing George Gershwin in the film biography of Gershwin for his first job, and he was fresh out of burlesque and nightclubs. I mean, he wasn't a well-known actor at all. And the day or the week he started shooting this big picture, which was a tremendous opportunity for him, that's when I got polio. So he had this tremendous distraction while he was doing the most important thing he had done up until then. And the treatment was very painful. It was almost scalding hot squares of woolen blankets wrapped around every limb. And every hour they'd be changed. So every hour you were getting a scalding. And my parents couldn't afford help. They had to do it themselves. So they had to, in a way, be forced to torture their own kid. And there were massages that were so painful where they'd stretch out the muscles because the muscles contract in polio. And if you let them contract and stay that way, you get immobilized. And I don't have any, as far as I know, no residual effects from that disease. I think it was because in part of the treatment I got, which was invented by a nurse in Australia called Elizabeth Kenny. And she had just come to the United States to lecture about her treatment, which was not accepted by doctors in Australia because it was coming from a nurse. And they didn't want to hear anything about medicine from a nurse. And it was kind of the opposite of what they did. They encased the limbs in plaster of Paris casts, kind of made them stiff, and it didn't help. She was massaging them and heating them up and getting the muscles limber again. Since then, doctors have said to me that they didn't think that treatment worked. But these are doctors who weren't born then, and they'd never seen the treatment practiced, never tested it. So I don't know if they really understand what it was. They're sort of taking the same position that the doctors took in Australia. It was an interesting experience because I was in bed getting this treatment for months. Kind of interesting to be exposed to that pain and that hoping for the best. And just like this epidemic, this pandemic, that was an epidemic, by the way, that was very seriously responded to by the country. People were afraid to let their children play with other children. Friends wouldn't come visit me long after I was no longer infectious. But they were scared, you know, and nobody knew what really was going on. It was very much like now.
Well, I know you've mentioned that you were bullied a lot as a kid. Is it related to that or something entirely different?
No, I was bullied because I was a smartass.
You were like a young Hawkeye Pierce as a kid?
Maybe a little worse. But I remember one of the first, I had tutors after I was sick for years. I didn't go to regular school until like the 7th grade. So I was in a public school and I walked out at lunchtime into the yard where there were picnic tables. This was in California. And I saw all these kids and I thought, wow, look at the size of that audience. To me, other people were an audience. And I got up on a picnic table and started tap dancing. And the bullying started shortly thereafter.
Well, that explains it.
Yeah, right. I think I've calmed down since then.
So just to fast forward a bit as you're getting into acting, I thought it was interesting that your father was pushing you to go into medicine because, I mean, he eventually ended up finding his way and was very successful, is my understanding, you know, as an entertainer, as a performer. And oftentimes, you know, you like your kids to follow in your footsteps. Why was he so much against your pursuing what he'd built his career on?
First of all, he had always wanted to be a doctor himself. He was very curious. He wasn't well educated and he wasn't well read, but he admired doctors and he wished he could have. He studied architecture and was beginning to be an architect when the Depression hit. And the only work he could get was as a singer. I think beyond wanting to be a doctor himself, he also realized really in a powerful personal way how precarious this profession is. You have to be really lucky. He had 2 major accomplishments in his life. He played George Gershwin, who was a big hit around the world. Then the studio put him in lousy pictures for 7 years, and he disappeared practically. At the end of the 7 years, he got asked to play the leading part in Guys and Dolls on Broadway. Another huge hit. They were the only successes he had in his whole career. After Guys and Dolls, he was trying to do talk shows and game shows. He barely got by.
So I guess it was a tougher life than I imagined he had. So he wanted something better for you.
There's almost nobody who doesn't have a hard life in show business. I often think of Katharine Hepburn. I think she was only 24 and had been very successful, and then made a couple of pictures that didn't do any business. And the headline in Variety was, Katharine Hepburn is box office poison. At 24, how do you go on from that? And then there she was, I think in her 80s, still playing leads. She managed to weather it. But you have ups and downs. Everybody has ups and downs where you think, I wonder if I'll work again. So my father wanted to spare me from that, but I've been lucky and I didn't need sparing.
Well, I mean, lest there be any misinterpretation, I mean, you certainly weren't an overnight success. It wasn't like MASH was your first gig. So what I'm curious is, in between the gigs, which were few and far between in those early years, what were you doing to work on your craft? Were you taking classes? Did you have a coach? Were you studying other actors? Because it's not like you had that much time, on the theater stage or in front of a camera to actually practice. So what did you do?
Well, I had a lot of small parts on the stage and in summer stock and theaters around the country. I was able to play leads. And the way I learned acting to start with was observing other people, but mainly starting with watching my father and his fellow actors in burlesque, and then in nightclubs, and then vaudeville, and then on the Broadway stage. I stood in the wings and watched Guys and Dolls almost every Saturday for 2 years. And when you watch from the side, you get an understanding of the process that you can't get when you're sitting in the audience. You see how they create the illusion. You're just a couple of feet from them sometimes, and they're communicating with the audience, but you see the sweat flying off them. If you see them more than once, you see the variety in their performance. You see them really connecting with one another, and you learn. If you're really interested in observing, I think that's one of the best ways. But then the only thing I really studied was improvisation. Not comedy improvisation. I did comedy improvisation. A little bit at Second City and a little bit at a company of Compass. We did Compass in Hyannisport, in the same hotel where John Kennedy would give his press conferences in the morning. And at night in the cabaret in the basement, I would play him giving a press conference, impromptu. And the same reporters who would ask him questions in the morning would be asking me questions at night in the basement. But his answers hadn't been in the paper yet, so I didn't know what they were talking about. I had to really improvise. But that improvisation study that I did with Paul Sills, who started Second City, was a very basic, pure kind of improvisation where the point is not to be funny. The point is to transform and discover things that you really didn't expect to be there. It was a time that changed my life. It changed me as an actor, and it changed me a little bit as a person too, because the basis of it is to connect with the other player. And through that, life happens. So that turns out to be important in real life as well. If you really can connect with the other person, stuff happens between you that wouldn't happen ordinarily. So that became the basis for me many years later when I was trying to help scientists communicate better. I realized that if I taught them something about improvising to start with, they would make a connection first with the people they were improvising with, and then they could turn to an audience and make that same connection. And that connection would lead to them choosing images and words and analogies that would make their very complex work clear. And the result is it not only made it clear to the audience, it turns out that it makes it clear to other scientists, especially those in different fields, to funders, to Congress. You need money from Congress. They have to understand what you're talking about before they give you the money. Scientists have even told me that they understand their own work better once they connect to the work itself at a broad level, at a broad enough level that they can explain it to someone who doesn't understand it. They understand it better. So all that comes from improvising, which was the only thing the only other thing I formally studied was mime with Etienne Decroux.
Well, it seems that MASH is where you really started to mature as an actor. And there's a quote from one of your books, and I think it speaks to what you're talking about here with the relating to people. I'm just going to read the quote. and this is you talking about your time during MASH, I began to understand that what I do in a scene is not as important as what happens between me and the other person. And listening is what lets it happen. It's almost always the other person who causes you to say what you say next. You don't have to figure out what you'll say. You have to listen so simply, so innocently, that the other person brings about a change in you that makes you say it and informs the way you say it.
Yeah, well said. Very good.
What it's your quote, buddy.
I have to compliment you on that.
No, it's really interesting. Was that the time where you just really changed in terms of how you approach the craft?
Yeah, it made a tremendous difference for me, and it was the beginning. It didn't overwhelm me overnight as a person, but it was the beginning of understanding how to relate to other people, which I'm still learning. I think you can never stop learning that. What is the other person going through that changes the way I speak to them? That could be a variety of things, a variety of situations. It could be, what are you going through once I say the first thing I have to say to you? What has changed in your point of view from that? So now can I follow it up with this next thing? It could also be someone you know just died, or you just lost your job. Isn't that going to change the way I speak to you if I'm really taking you in? And not fake sympathy, but really taking in where you are, what you need at the moment, what would be helpful. One of the tenets of improvising is you want to make your partner look good. The partner's not there to make you look good. You're there to make the partner look good. And that's taking care of the other person. So that's an example of how it can apply in life too, I think.
I know you've mentioned in the past that one of the things you did during the set of MASH is you made it a priority, you and your fellow cast members, to get together in between scenes, in between takes, and just enjoy each other's company and just get to know one another and laugh together and share stories, and that would help with the bonding and the relating and all the things you're talking about, which I think is really interesting. I alluded earlier to method acting, and I know this is a topic beyond the time we have here, but I did want to get your thoughts, because there's a lot of famous actors out there, who are known to use this technique, if you will, to just truly immerse themselves into a role and even stay in character off camera. So Dustin Hoffman, Robert De Niro, Daniel Day-Lewis, Jack Nicholson, Heath Ledger, Christian Bale. I mean, a small group amongst many more that are known to practice that. Did you ever try that?
I actually tried once during a whole movie to stay in character all day long. It was exhausting. And I've managed to stay in character between shots, but not during the movie. The funniest example to me of that is I heard that Daniel Day-Lewis, who was a wonderful actor, stayed in character playing Lincoln the whole time. And I heard that he even asked everybody on the set to call him Mr. Lincoln when they talked to him.
And not Mr. President?
Or maybe Mr. President. So one time, another actor came over to him and said, "Mr. President, I loved you in my left foot."
He probably didn't see the humor in that, I'm guessing.
Well, maybe he did. He seems like a very nice person.
But what do you feel? Is it just different strokes for different folks? That's their thing, and I don't,
You know what I think I've come to learn is, regardless of what training you've had or haven't had, everybody has to kind of invent their own system, their own method. And sometimes for a long time, I felt I never settled on one. I came up with a new way of approaching it depending on what I was playing and how I was able to get to it at that moment. I've tried so many different ways. Now I tend to gravitate towards some of the same practices. But it's hard to talk about this stuff. It sounds goofy and touchy-feely. But the thing is, You got to get your brain somehow so devoted to what you're doing and to how you understand what you're doing that the rest of your body comes along with it. So you're not telling your body or your voice or your face what to do. It's alive and operating very much on its own, in spite of the fact that you're thinking of 100 different things in the middle of a performance, especially in a movie where you have to be on a piece of tape on the floor. If you're off that piece of tape, you're out of focus. You have to be in the light. You can't cast a shadow on your partner. You got to get out of the shadow they cast on you. You have to be able to project yourself toward the end of the script, sometimes in the first shot of the movie. First one they shoot is the closing scene sometimes. And that's something you've had to build up to all during the movie. And you don't get a chance to build up to it. So to the extent that that happens, movie making is strangely very intuitive and improvisatory. And yet it's also very intellectual because you have to plan out where you're going to be in the future when you don't really know where you're going to be. And you don't want that knowledge of the future to take away from the spontaneity of the present. So it's hard stuff. It's also ecstatic. I love it. There's a wonderful feeling of flying when it goes well.
Well, Alan, it's estimated that about 105 million people tuned in to watch the season finale of MASH. To this day, it's one of my favorite shows ever. Not everyone's watched it, though. We got some younger listeners as well. So just to put that in perspective, look at some of the best, comedies ever. Seinfeld, Friends, Cheers. None of them came close to hitting that mark. And let's remember, this is back in the 80s. So these are the days before the internet, before YouTube videos. So those are people watching this thing live, which is just incredible. So it certainly speaks to the popularity of the show, which would speak to the popularity of you, Alan Alda. I'm guessing that over the course of that show, you must have lost your anonymity to some degree in your personal life as well. Was it tough adjusting?
Yeah, it was. Actually, it was very hard for me. It was hard for me, even though I had seen my father become famous and saw how he coped with it. When it happens to you, it happens in its own special way. I was unaccustomed to people coming up to me and pulling at me and talking about me as if I wasn't there, actually treating me a lot like an object. My face was known to them, but nothing about me was known to them. So it wasn't even my work that they were interested in. They were just interested in seeing this famous thing. Now, a lot of people don't know what's wrong with that. A lot of people think, if only I were rich and famous, I wouldn't have any problems. Well, they're two separate things in the first place. There are people who are rich and not famous. That's really much better than being famous, whether you're rich or not. It actually takes a lot of effort and money and time, focused to be famous. To be rich just involves a lot of mint juleps. But the experience was so surprising and daunting for me that for a few months I would have night terrors because during the day, people would literally be pulling at my clothing if I went into a public space. And, it's not just me. It's anybody who's newly well-known, newly hot. I often thought at that time, it's too bad that people who have been through this before can't get a support group for people who are just entering into it and help us get through it. Because it's a shift in the way you relate to people. And I had these horrible dreams where somebody was trying to choke me. It wasn't so much a dream. It was, I saw the person in the room. It was more like a hallucination. It went away after a while.
Can we get the psychiatrist from MASH to dissect that?
Yeah, he kept telling me I'm not a psychiatrist.
You mentioned how you, post MASH, and obviously you've gone on to have a number of roles, but you took a bit of a detour, hosting this show, Scientific American Frontiers, interviewing leading scientists around the world. What was the attraction of that for you? It
was to talk to the scientists and personally learn about their work. And at first, I was asked to just introduce the show on camera by myself and then disappear and later read a narration. But I knew if that were the case, I would never meet the scientists. But if I interviewed them, I'd be able to spend all day with them, sometimes on camera, sometimes having lunch, and I'd learn. And I'm fascinated by science. So I suggested that to the producers, and they took a chance because I didn't have any experience as an interviewer. But what happened was I used the same techniques that I use in acting to connect to the other person. All the things I learned from improvising came into play when it was just me and the scientist. And that changed the relationship that we had. It wasn't me asking a list of questions. It was me really trying to understand the other person. And that changed their attitude. They couldn't just give me a stock mini lecture. They had to really relate to me and see if I was getting it. And I let them know if I wasn't getting it. I'd grab them by the lapels and I don't say it some other way. I don't know what you're talking about. And as a result, we had something that you usually don't see, which is something taking place that is sort of the process of understanding. And eventually, when I got it, the hope was that the audience would get it too, vicariously through my struggle to get it. And that's how I began to realize that probably we could train scientists to have that same connection with an audience that they had with me. And the way we could do it would be to start by teaching them improvisation. So I experimented with that with some students in engineering, and I had them talk about their work for a minute or two. Then we improvised for 3 hours. I taught them basic improvisation exercises and games. And then they talked about their work again for a minute or two, and it was shocking how much more personal and vivid it was, how much clearer it was, because they were connecting to the audience. They wanted the audience to understand them. They weren't connecting to, here's my song, here's my description of the work. I figured this description out, and it's the best description available, and now I'm going to spray it at you. On the contrary, they were thinking, how does this get into this other person's head? There's a big difference between those two. Not the message in and of itself, but the message as it lands on the other person. How best can it land and stick in the mind of the other person? So I helped start what's now called the Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. And we've trained 15,000, more than that. I must be 16 or 17 now, 1,000 scientists, starting with improvisation and then moving into crafting the message based on what they've learned through the improvisation exercises, so that it's not two different things. It's not, now we'll improvise and warm up, and now we'll get serious and work on the message. The improvisation enables you to figure out what the message is depending on who you're going to be talking to and how it alters as you tell them. It's been very exciting for me. All the things I've done all my life are coming to fruition in a way I never expected, which is an improvisation in itself.
I so admire what you're doing there, and the value of it is pretty self-evident. But you could think of, my gosh, I mean, most people could certainly use some help with communicating. Teachers, attorneys, business professionals. But, clearly between the show and this center, there's some sort of mission you've been on, helping scientists in particular. And that's what I'm curious about. What is it about wanting to enable this specific group of people that was so important to you?
Well, I think what we're living through now is a really good example of how important it is to communicate science and what science means, what the process is. If we all thought a little bit more like scientists, we might make better decisions. What's the evidence? What are the facts? Not what do we wish for? What do we want? How can we change it to its rosiest picture. But what are we really facing? I've really come to believe when I face events in my own life that reality is my friend, no matter how rotten the reality is. If I don't know as much about it as I can't deal with it. An example of that is what we're living through now, where we're trying to learn how to get back to normal somehow, or what will the new normal be. We need clear thinking. We need thinking based on evidence. We need to know what the facts are. We need to gather new facts. We need to make more observations. Communication is so important. I think the times we're living in now are a kind of proof of what I grasped intuitively years ago when I said that I don't think communication is something you add on to science. It's of the essence of science. In the most basic way, you have to communicate the experiment you did so somebody else can replicate it. But you also have to communicate what you came up with so other people can pick up on that and use it or improve on it. Yeah, it's funny. Your mind picks up things that I never connected before. This is very much like what an anthropologist said to me about the difference between modern humans and Neanderthals. He said it was the advance in technology that the modern humans were able to make that helped them outlive the Neanderthals. And the reason that they could make changes in the technology, where the Neanderthals had a tool that didn't change for maybe 10,000, 20,000 years, it was just a big rock that came to a point and they could pick it up with both hands and do stuff with it. And the modern humans would change their tools constantly. They'd keep improving on them. And it was because they could say, look what I got here. Look what I can do with it. And the other guy says, that's great. Now how about we try it like this? It's an indication that that's maybe what happened. I don't think you could say it's definitely what happened because we don't have fossils of speech. We don't have fossils of people sharing things. But how else could that change take place if there weren't different minds collaborating? At least it's a nice myth. It's a nice origin story. And it encourages us to share ideas with each other and test them out and not be accepting of everything that comes in. Some of the most impressive scientists I've ever met or read about are those who attack their own ideas first before anybody else can, to try to see what's wrong with the idea. Just because I thought of it doesn't make it a good idea. But a lot of us think that way, and it may be holding us back.
So as you take a step back and reflect over your life, I think you've received 6 Emmys. There was a year where you were nominated for an Emmy, a Tony, and an Oscar, all in the same year. And as you mentioned, a best-selling book as well, right, during that year. So, I mean, Alan, as you know, most artists strive for just one of those accolades over their entire lifetime. There's a question in here somewhere. I mean, I guess, are you able to appreciate what you've done? Are you proud of what you've achieved? It's incredible. How do you feel about it?
I look at it. I guess I look at it more from the inside than your question implies. I don't think about it from me. I don't think of, oh boy, I got these awards. I really am mainly concerned with trying to get better at what I do. That's more important to me. I mean, that's if I can get better at something, I can see the difference between the way I used to be able to attempt to accomplish something and the way I actually can accomplish it better now. That's the kind of award that I'm more interested in. It's really nice to get an award, but there are so many factors that go into it. You can't take it too seriously. You can't think I must be hot stuff now.
So here's I've got to throw one hypothetical at you. 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, every single trace of your career has been wiped out, save for one single scene from a movie, a show, a play, one scene on a YouTube video that future generations can look at. What scene would you choose? What's the one moment, the one scene that you look back on and feel that was, that's one I don't want anyone to ever miss out on?
It doesn't matter what I want. The one they're going to play is the one I'm most embarrassed about now.
Which is?
The book doesn't, I can't even, there's such a long list, I can't pick one out. Let's get real about this. First of all, 1,000 years from now, they won't even be able to play. They won't have a machine that can play anything that now exists. And the other thing is they'll have no reason to play it because everybody who's alive now, with the exception of one or two people, will be forgotten. There's a cemetery in Paris that's a perfect example of this, called Père Lachaise. And it's acres and acres of huge monuments, 2-3 stories high, dedicated to dead people you never heard of. And I think, boy, they go to a lot of trouble to try to be remembered. But given time, we all get disappeared. And that's fine. If we can leave behind something that's still useful, and it probably won't be a performance, it'll probably be an idea or a technique. If we can be one of those modern humans who helped make an advance in a tool, and the tool turned out to be useful for a few hundred or a few thousand years, that's something worth leaving behind. Whether it's associated with my name or not, if I've actually stumbled across something that will turn out to be useful in the future in helping people communicate better, I'll feel a lot better than if they remember how well I told a joke. It's not as interesting to me.
Alan, you came out publicly last year that you have Parkinson's.
Uh-huh.
How's that been going? Has that been okay? Has it been a struggle?
I'm handling it pretty well, I think. I exercise a lot. I read up on it, and I'm looking for any way that'll diminish the symptoms. I shake a little bit now. So I'm looking forward to a play where I can play a malted milk machine, really be able to deliver. Actually, the last couple of things I did, I shook a little, but it didn't seem to matter. One of the reasons I talked about it was that I would like it to become more accepted as something that more and more of us have to go through. For some reason, there's a rising trend in Parkinson's patients' diagnoses. And there's still a stigma attached to it. So that when people get diagnosed, sometimes they fall apart and they think my life is over. And they get depressed and don't do what can be done to hold off worse symptoms for quite a while. That's not good. And eventually there'll be some kind of treatment that'll help us get out of this spiraling disease. But until they come up with that, why would we not want to do what can be done to hold off the worst? Rather than thinking, oh, the worst is here. The worst is not here when you get the diagnosis. Although it's shocking that by the time you show symptoms, I've read that up to 80% of your dopamine-producing neurons have already been killed off. So it's pretty advanced when the symptoms do show up. Again, it's amazing that you can get by with fewer and fewer neurons. But I thought if I came out and talked about it, that I could help a little bit. But personally, I'm doing fine. It's one of the things, it's one of the realities of my life. It's one of the part-time jobs I have to cope with it. I take boxing lessons.
Boxing? You're boxing?
Yeah, I wouldn't actually try it on a real person. But
Speaking of boxing, hitting, I thought it was sort of fascinating how you self-diagnosed the Parkinson's to some degree before you even went to the doctor. Could you share that?
Yeah, I was pretty sure I had it because I had read an article in the New York Times about a couple of doctors who felt that a high percentage of people who had a certain experience turned out to have Parkinson's. And the experience was acting out your dreams. For instance, In my case, I was having a dream that somebody was attacking me and I threw a sack of potatoes at the other person. But in reality, what I was doing was throwing a pillow at my wife. But I had a couple of experiences like that. And having read the article, I thought, I want to get tested. I want to get a scan to see if I have it. So I went to a neurologist and he gave me the usual visual exam, how's your balance and various things like that. He said, I don't know why you want to scan. You don't have Parkinson's. I said, I think I do a little bit. So he gave me the scan, and a week later he said, boy, you really got it. But that was good because all I had was the sleep, the acting out, the poor sleep symptom. But I was beginning to get a slight twitch in my thumb. So it was very early, but I could get to work on exercise, earlier than I would have if I waited for symptoms to be really evident. And I think that's helped a little bit. You don't really know because you don't know how fast it's progressing.
Alan, the name of this podcast is The Art of Excellence. I always enjoy listening how my guests like to define that word, excellence. What's it mean to you?
I always have a lot of trouble with the word excellence. Sorry about that. I know you've chosen it as
No, it's all right.
The title of your show.
What do you struggle with?
Because to me it implies not just better than, which is bad enough, but the best. It's more like a goal than a possibility. Rather than excellence, I'd rather shoot for pretty damn good. I had an acting coach in college, and he said, you should shoot for competence. If you can be competent, you're okay. That sounds like not much to shoot for. But if you've really taken care of business, it's not a bad goal. Jack Benny said once, when people said to him, how do you manage to do such a great show week after week? He said, we try never to do a lousy show. Something gives you a little more freedom. I have to be excellent. I have to squeeze myself into a pretzel to not make any mistakes. Mistakes are wonderful. Mistakes are powerful springboards to new things, sometimes better things.
Maybe I should change it to The Art of Pretty Damn Good. That'll be the next one. But
well, try that out. You never know. See if your numbers fall off by the thousands.
Alan, this interview honestly was pretty damn good. I really enjoyed this. Honestly did. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Well, now before I go, I have to be practical and mention my podcast, Clear and Vivid, which I love doing. And I have probably the same experience you do because you talk to such interesting people. Isn't it wonderful to have conversations with interesting people? I just love it.
It is the most enjoyable thing I've done in a long, long time. I don't play guitar. I don't play piano. I don't sing. This is my creative outlet, I guess.
Well, you do a great job at it. It's pretty damn good.
Oh, well, thank you. That's incredibly generous of you to say. Really is, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you. I've had a good time talking with you.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go. Don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You can do it on your phone. You can do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.